Hello, my fair friends. I'm Ruby Rose. This is Baby Bunny, and welcome to Fairy Fortunes. Now, if you hear a siren going off in the background, well, there is a very loud tornado warning going on right now, and there's really not much I can do about it. So, but hopefully Bunny and I will be warm and dry in our little abode here. So you do not have to worry about us. We will not be taken away to Oz today. So thank you for joining us. Today I am continuing my series on the ABCs of mythology. And today, G is for ghost. Ooh. So yes, ghosts. Now, as I was putting together this series for mythology, I really wanted to put together mythology that had some correlation in some shape or form to the Fae, of course, because that is, of course, what Fairy Fortunes is all about, is talking about different fairy creatures, doing divination with assistance from those beings and that sort of thing. So I did want to capture a fairy element in my ABCs of mythology. So, G is for ghost. Now, you might think that ghosts have nothing to do with mythology. However, they are often correlated to the Fae. And the reason for that is that, as I explained in my previous video on F is for the Fairy Faith, I talked about the mythology of the Fae and how it is a true mythology because those traditional stories of the Fae explained, or was an attempt to explain, or was an attempt to give meaning to cultural and natural phenomenon. And one of the phenomenons that I pointed out that really jumped into mythology beyond a definition of folklore was that overarching, that repeating story of fairy creatures stealing away children. And what it was is that the fairies would take the children and the children would live with them forever in the land, in the realm of the Fae. Another overarching story was this concept of the wild hunt. Now, the wild hunt is a story that we will see throughout many different human cultures, and the idea is that the hunt was often associated with the winter solstice, but not in every culture. But that is a big one, is that during the winter solstice there would be this amazing wild hunt that included the fairy creatures, and in this wild hunt where they would have entourages and hunting parties, and it was this huge festive event for the Fae, is that they would bring with them their human captives. And so human beings often would be stolen into the land of the fairy, and often I believe that once again we're delving into the land of mythology more than folklore, because it was a way to give meaning to the death of a loved one. They weren't dead necessarily, they were still living, but just with the Fae folk. And so during this time of the wild hunt is that you might be able, if you were able to catch a glimpse of the wild hunt, you then might be able to see your loved one in the entourage of the fairy. And there is some speculation in fairy belief structures that the human dead, the ancestral spirits, are fairy beings. I think that actually there's a distinction between those two things. I think that the Fae that I often refer to, the Fae beings that I talk about in my divination system, they were never human. Those are sentient beings that are completely separate. They never had a human existence. the ancestral dead can be helpful and can often the human dead, especially in Japan, there is still a thriving tradition of honoring the ancestors. And also this is prominent in modern Western pagan cultures as well, is an ancestral honoring where ancestors are given offerings and sought for assistance. The idea is that in ancient times you did not consult a god. A god was often far too removed from the situation at hand, so you would consult a fairy creature for assistance, or you would consult an ancestor, particularly if it had to do with a home life situation. You wouldn't necessarily want to call a fairy creature into your home to protect it, because fairy creatures are notoriously unpredictable in that regard. Their idea of protection is probably a lot different than a human's idea, so the ancestors would be called upon instead for that protection of the home. So definitely the term banshee actually I think is a connection to the beings, the she, which are beings, very fair of face beings that I believe are very similar to the Scandinavian Alfar, or elves as most people refer to them in modern times. So a banshee was a spirit that would warn of an impending death. However, these spirits were seen possibly as ancestral spirits, spirits of ancestors that were connected to the family, who were alerting you that one of your members was going to be joining them. So these are examples of how ghosts and the Fae are very much intertwined in these traditional stories of the fairy folk. But how's that mythology? I'm getting to that. However, I wanted to point out that ghosts are heavily featured in many mythologies. So, for example, many people are familiar with Greco-Roman mythology, and there are numerous examples of ghosts being featured in mythological stories. So, for example, when Odysseus travels to the underworld in the Odyssey, he meets a variety of ghosts that are, they are referred to in shades, but shades is another word for ghost. In the Aeneid, Aeneas also travels to the underworld, and that is another example of mythology featuring a shade or a ghost. And one of my personal favorite stories is the story of Orpheus. Orpheus, not to be confused with Morpheus, the god of sleep. Orpheus was a human being who was particularly gifted with music. The lyre was his instrument of choice, and he was said to be incredibly skilled enough to rival those of the gods. In fact, his lyre was a gift from the god Apollo, who was very impressed and taken by Orpheus's abilities. Now, Orpheus, unfortunately, was married, and his wife passed away, as often people do. But he decided that he could not live without her, and so he journeys into the underworld and charms Chiron, the ferryman, to take him to see Hades and his queen Persephone. And there he asks Persephone and Hades for permission to take his bride back to the land of the living. And he plays in order to convince them, and as an offering, he plays before them his beautiful music, and they are both so moved, especially Persephone. In some versions of the stories it is Hades alone, but in the more accurate depiction, I think, is of Persephone, because she is not only the goddess of death, she is the goddess of rebirth. So anybody walking out of the realm of Hades has to go through her. So Persephone was so moved by Orpheus's music that she agrees to allow him to take his wife back to the land of the living. However, she and her husband Hades tell him very, very carefully and clearly that he is not to look behind him as he exits the underworld. Because if he does, then she will have to stay in the realm of the underworld. And of course, the tragedy is that he does look back to make sure that she is behind him, and when he does, he gets a glimpse of her and she fades away back into the underworld. And I think what that story, what meaning that gave, what the importance of that mythology story, because mythology, I believe, is a way to give context and meaning to these natural and social phenomenons that happen in our lives. So how do we deal with death? And in the case of Orpheus's story, he was distraught. He felt like he could not go on without his wife, but the inevitable nature of death is that when it comes, it comes. And it is something that is tragic and sad, but it is the natural order of things. And so Orpheus's story was a way to process that grieving emotion, to help accept that inevitable, that the realm of the dead is the realm of the dead, and the realm of the living is a separate place. So those are some examples of ghosts in mythology. Another example is actually in Scandinavia. They actually have a god who is, in fact, a ghost. And that god is the god Balder the Bold. So now, I should make very clear that Balder is not like Hades and Persephone. He is not the god of the dead. He is actually dead himself. So that's in the Scandinavian tradition, is that gods are to some extent mortal and they can pass into the underworld themselves. The Scandinavians have a goddess who is the goddess of death, and her name is, are you ready for this? Her name is Hel. Interesting. Yes, that is her name. So she is responsible for the dead. Now, in Scandinavian tradition, I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, how does Valhalla come into play with that? Valhalla is one place where a human dead person could go. The goddess Freya actually had another realm where people who had been human and had died would go, and then the realm of Hel, Helheim, run by the goddess Hel, was where everyone else went. And people often think that Hel's realm is the Christian version of Hell, and it really wasn't. It was just a place where people went when they died, and that was where Balder went when he died. If you're not familiar with the story, many people are, because the god Thor and Odin are so popular in modern times right now. Rawr! Thank you, Avengers. We really appreciate Chris Hemsworth's work as the god Thor. I believe Thor approves, so good work, Chris. So many people are familiar with Thor's story, but Balder was the son of Odin and the brother of Thor, and his story is that he was invulnerable. His mother Frigg had gone to all of the beings in the world and had asked them not to harm or kill her son Balder, because not only was he Balder the Bold, he was Balder the Beautiful. and so Balder was very much Frigg's favorite son. However, as the story goes, is that she had forgotten to ask the plant mistletoe for that same permission. And Loki, the god of chaos, found this out, and so he fashioned a staff of mistletoe and gave it to one of the strong gods, and because they thought it was very fun to throw things at Balder because nothing would penetrate him or kill him. And so Loki handed off a staff of mistletoe, which unfortunately did pierce him and ended his life. So he had to go to the realm of the underworld, and much like the story that I told of Orpheus, is that Frigg did try to make a similar bargain with the goddess Hel, and she agreed that if she could find one person, if she could convince all people to weep for Balder and allow him to return to the land of the living, that she would do that for Frigg. Unfortunately, there was one giantess. Many versions of the story say that it was Loki in disguise, refused to weep for Balder, and therefore he had to stay in the underworld. And once again, as I explained, I believe that mythology is a way to give meaning to these natural and social phenomena that all humans have to deal with. And so the idea behind the story is that death is inevitable and comes for us all, but really is not something that we necessarily need to fear. So those are examples of ghosts in mythology, and actually even in Western Christian, Judeo-Christian traditions, there are ghosts that feature in Christian mythology. One example actually does not come from the main text, although the book Dante's Inferno, the Divine Comedy, has heavily influenced modern Christianity. That is where we get most of our modern concepts of Christian hell, not to be confused with the goddess Hel's realm of Helheim. And in Dante's Inferno, Dante descends into the underworld and is met by the ghost of Virgil, and Virgil is his guide throughout the Divine Comedy, throughout Dante's journey through hell and the underworld. So that is one example of Christian mythology featuring a ghost, and I really believe that even though Dante's Inferno was written as a passion poem in its time, it has really become a part of Christian mythology in today's world. But in the Bible itself, the Bible is actually not devoid of ghosts. It is frowned upon, of course, in Judeo-Christian tradition to use necromancy, to call up the spirits of the dead. But there is one very prominent story. In the books of Samuel, actually, there is a story of King Saul. So King Saul is very terrified of an imminent battle with the Philistines, and he doesn't know what to do, so he wants to consult with Samuel the prophet, but he has unfortunately died. Now, as I said, in Judeo-Christian tradition, it was frowned upon to be able to talk to the spirits of the dead and have necromantic abilities. And so most of the people and spirit mediums that were able to do this were run out, probably murdered. And so they have to find someone that can still do this. So he actually goes to see the Witch of Endor. So King Saul disguises himself and goes to see the Witch of Endor, who actually does, when she goes to consult with Samuel the prophet, she immediately is given the knowledge that he is King Saul, and she is very afraid for her own life at that point. But King Saul promises her that he will not kill her, and she brings forth the ghost of Samuel, and Samuel has a discussion, actually, with Saul. One of the first things he says is that he's very upset that Samuel called him forth, because it is frowned upon in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And then he proceeds to tell King Saul that he is going to lose the battle, and not only will he lose his life, his sons will as well. And that is another example of ghosts featuring heavily in mythology. So I hope you enjoyed this video today. If you did, please give Bunny and I a thumbs up. If you haven't already subscribed, I do hope you decide to subscribe to our channel. We'll be continuing this series on mythology, and I have some other series that I'm planning for, and hope you enjoy. And also, if you have a question that you would like to have answered by Fairy Fortunes, have it featured for free on the show, simply leave us your question in the comments below, and we will feature you on an episode of Fairy Fortunes. And with that, have a fairyful day.